I started FAMM in 1991. My brother was arrested in 1990 for growing marijuana, and I was working here in Washington at the Cato Institute as a public affairs director, and I got a call from my brother, and he was in jail in Spokane, Washington. And I said, what are you doing there? And he said, I was arrested for growing marijuana. So I thought, well, it's only marijuana. Okay, that was stupid of you. My first thought was, how stupid of you, but it's only marijuana, not a big deal. And then as his case unfolded, I found out that in fact he was facing 5 years in federal prison for growing marijuana. And it just, was like stunning to me, 5 years for growing marijuana. And in the end, he pled guilty because he was guilty, and the judge had to sentence him, but at sentencing, the judge says, I don't want to give you this much time, but my hands are tied by these sentencing laws that Congress has passed. And I just thought, that was contrary to everything I thought I'd learned in, Civics 101, that the judge was the one who would determine what the appropriate sentence was based on the role of the defendant and the likelihood of rehabilitation and all those factors that judges normally consider. But in cases that were, in drug cases that carried mandatory sentences, the judges didn't have any choice. So that's when I learned about mandatory sentencing laws. And as a result of my brother's sentence, I was, horrified. He'd go to prison for 5 years. There's no parole. So, it was a full 5-year sentence. But I was mostly outraged that the judge didn't have the ability to deliver the sentence he thought was appropriate. And I think that more than the, sadness over my brother going to prison for 5 years was what motivated me to start an organization to try to fight the laws, because it just seemed completely wrong to me, and still does 20 years later, that judges don't have the discretion to make the punishment fit the crime. When my brother got arrested, I think my parents immediately were like, what did we do wrong? Any parent would feel like somehow they failed their child, that he or she ends up, doing something illegal and then getting arrested for it and going to prison. It was also very humiliating. My dad wouldn't tell his siblings, the rest of his family, that my brother was arrested for growing marijuana and put into prison. They thought he was in school. That was the story that he told for basically 4 years. So parents, I think, deal with it differently. And I was immediately wanting to talk about it and give my brother's case as an example of how absurd the sentencing laws are. So I, was very public about it. I don't know how my dad's family didn't find out, given how public I was about it. I was on national news and, in lots of newspapers talking about it. But it's very hard for families, and I think that my brother was lucky in the sense that he didn't have a wife or children, so it was only affecting him immediately and his siblings and parents, but not in the way that you would feel if you had a family depending on you and you were going to prison, and how are they going to survive? And that happens all the time. 20 years into this, the sad letters I've read are still so motivating to me, to make me want to continue to fight, because people lose so much. It's not just the person that goes to prison. There's this whole ripple effect on their wife or their children and their parents and society at large, actually. But we don't look at it in that way. We want to lock people up, throw away the key, and then we're done with this problem. But in fact, I think that as a nation, we actually suffer when people are in prison. We're losing their tax revenue if they were working and contributing. We're supporting their family often with public assistance, so we're paying for their families to be assisted where they previously weren't. So I think there's just a whole lot of ripple effects that we are unaware of. In the sort of simplistic way we look at, you do the crime, you do the time. We are a nation that loves to punish. And I would so love to turn the ship from these 50-year sentences we're handing out back down to something that's rational. Even Bernie Madoff, he gets 150 years in prison. Now, he's done so much damage to so many people, and I'm the first to say he belongs in prison. But what is the point of a 150-year sentence? All it does is ratchet up sentencing to the level where when somebody gets 20 years, it doesn't sound like much. When I was a kid, 5 years in federal prison was like a big deal. Now, you're a marijuana grower and you get that much. So I think we've gone so far to the extreme in these punitive sentences, and somehow think that by stiffer and stiffer sentences we're going to stop people from using drugs, which clearly has not happened, or we're going to somehow deter them from doing whatever the crime is. And it's not an effective, deterrence is really not, long sentences is not an effective deterrent. And even the criminal justice experts say that it's the swiftness and certainty of punishment that deters people, not the length of sentence. So, I mean, I wish people would care, because it's a national issue. It affects every state in the country. It affects millions of families in this country. So I wish they'd care that we just don't overpunish. That I think it's an important American tenet that we need to kind of hang on to and get back to. Secondly, it's an economic issue, and at the state level, especially where state budgets are, crashing, the states are spending an exorbitant amount of money on prisons and corrections. So in California, they already spend more on corrections than they do on higher education. In Florida, they're about to hit that mark, I think, later this year. So really, if people think about if there's a better way to punish, whether it's an alternative, whether it's drug treatment, whether it's a shorter sentence, there's all kinds of combinations of ways to punish the person for breaking the law, but not punish the taxpayers as well by keeping the person there for so long. So I think that it's actually a pocketbook issue for a lot of people, and they don't realize it. There are little reforms that we have been able to accomplish over the past 20 years that have led to reduced sentences or fairer sentences for about 145,000 people. So I feel like we can see a direct result from our efforts, which is really important to me, because I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I thought nothing we had done in all this time had made any difference. The crack cocaine reform that just happened was great. I mean, it was a really important step toward greater reform, but it's not the end all. It took 15 years to get Congress to actually admit, okay, the quantity that triggers a 5-year sentence for crack cocaine is too small. It was only 5 grams. That's like 5 sweet and low packages. So they increased the quantity to 28 grams, which is an ounce. It didn't get rid of the mandatory minimums, which is our number one problem. You still go to prison for 5 years if you are distributing 28 grams of crack cocaine. It did get rid of the possession for crack cocaine. So in other words, if you have 28 grams of crack in your pocket and you're just, standing there on the street corner and you're not selling it to anybody, you're not supposed to be subjected to a 5-year mandatory sentence. You'll still be arrested, and they'll probably try to charge you with distribution, but you won't get a mandatory minimum if it's just possession. So, that was the first time since the Nixon administration that a drug mandatory sentence had been repealed, so that was great. So I have, faith that there will be greater reform. I'm not, this new Congress is a toss-up, and I don't think Democrats are a lot better than Republicans, so I'm actually very sort of neutral on who's in control. But I do think that we've started some momentum that I think will be continued in the new Congress. Jeff Sessions, who is a Republican on the Senate side and was a former U.S. attorney for 15 years, was the really important key in getting the crack cocaine bill passed. He was a sponsor of it. He understands that sentences are too long. For years he's been talking about trying to do something for the girlfriend cases where, she's sort of just there and not really the major player, but ends up getting 10 years in prison anyway. He wants to see if we can find ways to create opportunities to prevent that from happening. So there's always interest. It's just how big we can get it in Congress. I used to think when I started FAMM that Congress would change mandatory sentencing laws and all the states would follow suit. And now I kind of think it's the other way around. I think that the states are much greater sort of advocates for reform because of the budget issues, and they're just more willing to try things. I think that they're willing to try alternatives, drug courts, specialty courts of different kinds, to see if there's a way to reduce their prison populations. And so in some ways I think the states are going to lead the federal government. I think the most satisfying part of my job has always been the letters we get from families. I mean, oddly, even the ones where they're telling me how hard it is, those are the ones that sort of keep the fire burning, because it is painful to read how much the government is ripping families apart. And I'm not saying that people don't need to be punished. We've always said, if you break the law, there's a consequence, but the consequence has to be somewhat, relative to the crime and the person's role in the crime, and it generally isn't with mandatory sentences. So, so the letters always motivate me. And then the letters we get from people who have come out of prison as a result of something we've done. Like I received a letter last spring from a man who was serving a life sentence in Michigan for being convicted of the 650 lifer law. He had 650 grams of, I don't remember if it was cocaine or heroin, but at the time in the 70s, they had made that a life without parole. You were convicted of that crime and you were sentenced to life without parole. We worked for about 6 years in Michigan to get the law changed so that it's actually, they were eligible for parole after 15 years. So this man did 15 years in prison. He got out, and he sent me an invitation to his graduation from college, and that he was very excited to say he was going to be walking across the stage to pick up his diploma, and he was thanking me for giving him that opportunity. And I mean, there's nothing greater than thinking that you've actually changed somebody's life.